I did my doctoral work and I'm still doing some ongoing research, although not as much as I might like, on anchorites, and specifically one particular anchorite who was enclosed at one of the churches in the City of London in the early 16th century. And we'll sort of get onto him towards the end. So Charlotte asked me a while ago, would I do a ground floor guide to anchorites? And I suddenly thought, okay, maybe for the first time in 15 years, because I started my PhD in 2009, maybe I will finally come up with the definition of what is an anchorite, because people have been asking me for years. The best I've so far come up with is, well, an urban hermit, but even that's not quite right. So hopefully this will give some insight into what a large, or possibly larger than you might think, number of people chose as a form of religious life over the course of 3 or 4 centuries in the Middle Ages. So let's get started with the big questions. What is, or what was, an anchorite? Now, there are, as you probably know, plenty of examples in the Bible of people, and they were usually men, granted, spending time alone in the desert, trying to get away from God or wanting to spend more time with God. And we've got Elijah, we've got John the Baptist, and of course there's Jesus after his baptism. And this was a pattern that was followed in the early centuries of Christianity once it had become established. And again, it wasn't uncommon, and again, it was mostly men. There were some women, but mostly men, to go out into the desert to live alone. And it did tend to be the desert of North Africa and the Middle East. And as more of them took to doing that, they sort of started to gather in little clusters and form communities. And we have various words, all which have sort of Greek sources to describe that. So there's monk, from the Greek word monos, meaning alone. Hermit was just somebody who lived in the desert. But an anchorite was somebody who had withdrawn from the world. You quite often get people saying, oh, does it mean, are they called anchorites because they're anchored in one place? And that's sort of, in English, that's almost a serendipitous back formation of the word, but actually no, the original is from Greek and it does mean to withdraw from the world. But to start with, all those three terms, monk, hermit, anchorite, they were fairly interchangeable until you get Benedict in about the 6th century formalizing what becomes Western monasticism, when monk specifically refers to one of those who's living in a community under a particular rule and with particular vows. Moving on a bit to the 10th century, there is something of a revival of people going off and living as hermits. Not necessarily in the desert, but they are going off, they're living in wasteland, they're on their own. Sometimes this is the best way that they can find individually to be close to God. And it's only really then from the 13th century that the distinct form of religious life known as Anchoritism becomes understood as a withdrawing from the world and being physically enclosed somewhere. And it's that of being sort of confined to 1 or 2 rooms for what was intended to be the rest of your life from that point onwards. That was what came to determine an anchorite. Now, this wasn't limited to the British Isles, although it does seem to be mostly northern-ish continental Europe and the British Isles. And in this country, the records that have survived mostly tend to be from England. There were anchorites in Wales, Scotland, and Ireland, but the records are most prolific, maybe is the best way of putting it, for England. So I'm going to be talking basically about England in this. Now, the first major academic survey of hermits and anchorites was done by a lady called Rotha Mary Clay, and that was published in 1914. And it is still basically the touchstone work. If anybody is doing any academic work on Anchorites, they will start with Rotha Clay's book, even though quite a bit of it is now sort of been superseded, as you might expect. There has been more found out over the last century and a bit. And as you can see from this list, she's got, so the appendix of the book has lists of all the locations of anchor holes, locations of anchorites that she'd been able to source up to that point by county. Hermits and anchorites. So, you know, there was a very wide spread across England. There's only 3 counties in her list which don't have anchorites. They have hermits, but they don't have anchorites, and that's Buckinghamshire, Cumberland, and Rutland. I mean, Rutland's very small, so there's not space for much anyway. And obviously, as I said, there's been more work done over the last century, but it does give a good spread. But it's not always a case of, okay, there was in particular parts of the country, because Leicestershire and Norfolk aren't too far apart, but you've only got 1 anchorite in Leicestershire and 34 in Norfolk. Although, granted, of those 34 anchorites in Norfolk, over half of them were in Norwich. Now, anybody who knows Norwich and who knows anything about medieval Norwich knows that there were a lot of churches in Norwich, and there still are. And quite a lot of those had anchorites at various points in the Middle Ages. There are 20 sites in London, which specifically, as far as Clay's list is concerned, means north of the river. And of those 20, 16 are within the City of London. There's 2 more in Westminster, there's 1 in Holborn, and there's 1 in Kensington. In terms of Diocese of Southwark, we miss out quite a bit, really. There were anchorites in Sheen, but as far as I can tell, that's it. There were others in other bits of Kent and Surrey, but they now fall in the Diocese of Rochester, Canterbury, and Guildford. So we've, you know, unfortunately, this isn't something that Southwark is sort of renowned for, let's put it that way. So they were across pretty much all of England. And while there is some evidence of recluses who could be understood, if you like, to be within the anchoritic tradition before the Norman conquest, things only really get formalised from the mid-12th century. But it does then carry on into the 1540s, so it is quite a wide spread. And the figures here are taken from a book which was published in 1985, and that was really the next major work on anchorites. So you didn't really have much between 1914 and 1985. There were a few bits here and there, but nothing major in terms of a survey. It's really not, it's not an area of academic study that people are flocking to, shall we say. But as you can see from these figures from Anne Warren's book, it started small and then sort of built up. So by the 14th and the 15th centuries, you've got quite a lot of numbers. And what's important to realise is that whereas Clay was looking at locations, these are figures, as far as we can tell, of actual identifiable anchorites. And most hermits were men. Majority of anchorites were women. Now, there's always some sort of, you've got to caveat the figures a little bit, because sometimes all we've got is a record of saying, oh yes, there was an anchorite here. No idea when, and even if we got some idea when, we don't know what the name was. And sometimes if there is a name, it's unhelpfully gender non-specific. So there could be even more than 53% women, or there could be more than 26% men. We just genuinely don't know. And as I said, they carried on into the 1540s, and it looks like the latest recorded anchorite was a lady called Catherine Mann, who was in Norwich, and she was removed from her cell in 1548. so that is quite late. And of course, the most famous anchorite probably is Julian of Norwich, or rather the woman who is known as Julian of Norwich. That may not have been her baptismal name, because she was enclosed at St. Julian's Church in Norwich. So it may have been that she chose to be enclosed there because she was called Julian. She wanted to spend her life in enclosure under the dedication of her namesake, or it could just have been that that's where she was enclosed and she then became known as Julian of Norwich. And she was certainly known as Julian by the time Margery Kemp visited her in 1413. And I'll come back to Margery a bit later. So that's where and that's when, but why? Now, in a society that had very particular structures and hierarchies, anchorites, in many ways, those who became recluses ended up sort of living outside some of those structures and hierarchies because they weren't, strictly speaking, lay people, but the vast majority of them weren't members of recognized religious orders. And while some male anchorites were priests, this was actually a minority of the overall total. Now, these reasons for becoming an anchorite are taken from a guide for male anchorites, which was written in the early 15th century. It's called the Speculum Inclusorum, and the name literally means a mirror for recluses. But there's a lot of guides, religious and otherwise, written in this period, which are called speculum something or other, the mirror for something or other. And it's probable that the word in that sense means something like encyclopedia. So this is an encyclopedia for anchorites. Tells you everything you need to know about being an anchorite. And the author here lists 4 reasons why people might choose the anchoritic life. To be honest, I'm not sure I'd agree with the first one, that it's easier than life in the outside world, until you think about, actually, you're in one place, you have somebody else bringing your food, and again, I'll come on to that in a minute. You don't have to think about what you're going to do every day. So yeah, it might actually be easier than living outside. To do penance for past sins, to avoid the possibility of future sins, they're a bit self-serving, but they're understandable in what was a very religious society. But the main one was probably a desire to dedicate oneself wholly to the contemplation and praise of God, to be in one place where you had basically nothing else to do except read scripture, pray, focus on God. Now, the image I've put on the slide is from a manuscript which has instructions about the enclosure rights for anchorites. And if you can see, it is actually in colour in the original, but the book I scanned it from has it in black and white, which is slightly annoying. You've got the anchorite cell, you've got the anchoress, and it's supposed to be a woman, so just peering out through the little window that's left, with the bishop blessing her as she's enclosed. It is also worth remembering, given that 2 of the reasons for becoming an anchorite are to avoid, or one of them is to avoid the possibility of future sins. This guide is written for somebody who is already an anchorite. So it suggests rather that they might need reminding of why they went in the first place, every now and again. So that's some reasons why. So how did you then go about becoming enclosed as an anchorite? And it wasn't quite as straightforward once you'd made the decision to do this as finding a convenient church, maybe one which already had a cell or a house attached to it, moving in, and then finding somebody to block up the doorway. There was what we would think of maybe today as a discernment process. Although again, with pretty much anything, it's hard to tell from the records whether this was the theory, just the theory, or whether it actually happened in practice as well. So there'd be an assessment by the bishop or his representative, and this could go on for about a year, sort of a probation period before it got to the point of no return almost. You had to make sure that the community, the priest, the patron of the church, the people in that congregation actually were going to be okay with an anchorite attached to their church, possibly for decades. In some places, there was a history, there was a succession of anchorites. So by the time you got to the third or the fourth, maybe, the congregation, that particular church community, would know what was involved. Other times when they were setting up an anchor hold and putting things in place for the first time, you know, you had to make sure that everybody was okay with what was going on. And for female anchorites, they had to make sure that there was somebody who would act as their confessor. That could be the priest of the parish church that they were enclosed with, or it could be a priest from somewhere else. Somebody who would make sure that they were being appropriately instructed, and that the engagement that they were having with God once they were enclosed wasn't just sending them off in complete flights of fantasy. And then, of course, there was confirmation of the practical arrangements. Um, you had to have servants. I mean, it's one of those things that seems obvious once you think about it, but you don't always think about it. You've got somebody enclosed, great, fine. They're setting themselves up there, embarking on this intense spiritual life. Well, if they're going to do that for more than about a week without dropping dead, somebody needs to make sure that they've got food and drink. I mean, Deliveroo was a little way in the future yet, so they've got to sort something out. So there had to be a servant or servants hired, and there had to be the financial arrangement in place to make sure that the servant was paid for and that the food and everything else was paid for as well. So that was sort of what had to be done beforehand, and was a lot of practicalities. Once all that was in place, you then had the rite of enclosure, and there are several surviving liturgies, rites of enclosure, which do go into quite a lot of detail. And the one I've taken this from is from the mid 12th century, but it was still being used by the 15th century. And often the service of enclosure was conducted by the local bishop, although not always. And the candidate, there are instructions in the rite for the candidate to be supported during the service by two priests who should be older than the prospective anchorite, presumably there as figures of counsel and guidance. And it could be that one of those would be the anchorite's confessor, spiritual guide after enclosure. It's in the context of a Eucharist, and you have the candidate lying on the floor of the church to start with prayers said or sung over them, and they are blessed, sprinkled with holy water, censed with incense. They're given two candles to hold while listening to the readings, and the explanation in the rite says that these are to indicate that the candidate is to burn with love for God and love for neighbour. So it's very much yes, the whole point of this particular religious vocation is to spend more time with God, but you're not completely forgetting those who are around you as well. So burning for God, with love for God and for neighbour. Bible readings, the example given in the book that I've taken this from, Bible readings are a bit from Isaiah chapters 26 and 27. And it starts, "Come, my people, enter your chambers and shut your doors behind you." It's very much a physical expression of religious vocation. And then the gospel is Luke 10, Jesus with Martha and Mary. So you have the readings, you have the sermon, you have the Eucharist celebrated. And then the actual enclosure starts. So the candidate will be led to their cell. Usually, service up to this point will have happened in the church that the cell was attached to. That isn't always the case. Simon Appleby, the anchorite at All Hallows London Wall that I did my work on, most of his profession liturgy actually takes place at Holy Trinity Priory in Aldgate. So the vows, his profession document is dated and signed as at Holy Trinity Priory on Aldgate. There would then have been a procession to All Hallows London Wall, where the enclosure would have taken place. More often than not, though, the service would have been in the main bit of the church, and then they all troop outside and come into the cell. And from this point onwards, in the rite, everything is taken from the service for the burial of the dead. It was no small commitment to do this. The cell is then blessed as well as the anchorite. The anchorite is, if you like, anointed as if given last rites, and then the commendation is spoken over them. It is as if they are dying to their existing life. This is the bit that when I mention to people, it's just slightly spooky. There was an expectation that for however long the anchorite would be in their cell, there will be an open grave in the floor of the cell with them. And that will have been done as part of the preparation for enclosure. So they lie in that grave. There are more prayers from burial of the dead. And then everyone except the priest and the anchorite leaves the cell, at which point, if you like, the anchorite is reprieved from death for the time being. But they are then told to live in obedience the rest of their life within the cell. So having given that instruction to the anchorite, the priest leaves, and at that point, the entrance to the cell is blocked up. In some cases, it was actually bricked up. In other cases, it will have been a door that was closed from the outside. But it was very definitely being shut away from the world, apparently. Now, what would have been in that cell? Once you're in, what have you got with you? So you've got a bed, although various of the guides say that the bed should not be particularly comfortable. I mean, this is partly a life of penitence. You shouldn't get too comfortable with where you are. There may be a prayer desk, there may be an altar if the anchorite's a priest, and there's the open grave, as mentioned. In some places, there could be a garden or other outdoor space, but that would still be within the general bounds of the enclosure. Some anchor holes had 2 rooms or maybe a few more rooms. There could be one for the servants to live in, which was connected to the cell, probably by a window. There would, if the anchor hold, if the cell was attached to a church, there would be a window through which the anchorite could see the high altar, and this could be very small. Sometimes you see these still in churches. No, they're known as squints because you have to squint to see through them. And there'd be at least one, as I said, there'd be at least one other window so that the anchorite and the servant could communicate and pass things through. The servant could pass food and drink in, and the anchorite could pass other things out. And yes, that is what I'm talking about. No indoor plumbing, remember. And depending on the layout, there might also be another window where visitors could sit and talk with the anchorite. And the costs of living wouldn't have been high. I mean, by the time of the 14th century, a penny a day would have been enough to keep a reasonable diet going. It wouldn't have been particularly exciting, but it would have kept them alive. So, you know, that's why there needed to be the guarantee of financial support. And some of the financial support could come from just people passing by and giving donations. Most of the time, there would be an agreement in place, and it could be the patron of the church was also providing for the anchorite, or it could be somebody who just had a connection with that church, or even with the individual anchorite. And you've got instances of royalty and of nobility supporting anchorites. Again, sometimes particular people, sometimes in specific places, on a long-term, ongoing basis. Sometimes the anchorite will have a cat. I think there's a window, I think it's in Norwich Cathedral, which shows Julian with a cat. So it wasn't unknown for there to be something to keep you company in the cell. And the image I put on this slide, it's at a slight angle because I was taking a photo of the manuscript on display in the exhibition at the British Library. So it's sort of, the book is open like that, and I was trying to get the best angle right up against the glass case. And again, it's another image of an anchorite being enclosed, although this time you can't see, it's the back view. The anchorite is going in to the cell with the bishop outside blessing them. And if you can get to that exhibition, the BL, it opened about 10 days ago, it's on, I think, until February. It's absolutely fantastic. And it's got Julian's manuscript, or the manuscript of Julian's Revelation, and it's got the Book of Marjorie Kemp, which again I'll come on to a bit later. So that's sort of like the practical side of how you survived in an anchorite cell. What about the spiritual side? Well, you weren't short of guides to tell you how to do it, put it that way. I've already mentioned Speculum Inclusorum, the one from the 15th century, but you've got ones going back to the 12th century. The most well-known of all of them is Anchorena Wissa, the Guide for Anchoresses, which again was written in the 1220s, and it was copied and adapted through the next couple of centuries. And this deals with everything that the anchorite needs to know, from how to recruit servants, what sort of things an anchorite should be eating or not, how an anchorite's day should be structured, and how to make sure that appropriate occupation was undertaken. Just sitting there twiddling your thumbs was not an option. And it's in Anchorena Wissa that there is permission to have a cat, should that be desired. And what is interesting, or at least I think it is the fact that there are so many guides and rules for anchorites suggests that they were expected to be able to read. So even there, you've got this idea that those seeking this particular religious life, they will have been from a particular stratum of society and above. You almost certainly had to be able to read to some level. Now, the pattern of an anchorite's life will have included regular times of prayer every day, which probably included reciting the Psalms. And it could have been that part of the preparation beforehand was learning the prayers and the Psalms by heart. So it would have been possible to have been an anchorite if you were illiterate, because you could have had enough preparation beforehand that you knew the prayers and the Psalms that you needed to say every day. But the fact that there are so many guides does suggest that literacy was presumed. The guides, of course, as well as telling you what to do, also guide against what not to do. And yes, you had to have servants to make sure that you stayed alive, basically. But you were definitely not allowed to gossip with them, however tempting that might be. And visitors could be encouraged, especially those who are coming for spiritual guidance. But discretion should be exercised in those encounters, especially when it came to accepting gifts. And anchorites should always aim to listen more than they spoke. There is also evidence of some anchorites taking on embroidery, producing things for churches, whether their own or elsewhere. There's also book copying, and as we know from Julian and also from Simon Appleby at All Hallows, some anchorites did do their own original writing. However, there is much, much more writing for anchorites than there is by anchorites. And again, that reflects something which we tend to take for granted these days, that if reading and writing just go together. In the Middle Ages, they didn't. Many more people could read than could write. And if people could write, they might just be able to write their name or something. So anchorites involved in original theological writing or original writing of any kind is fairly rare. Now, I've mentioned visitors quite a lot, and this is where you get the great paradox of anchoritic life. Anchorites were people who had chosen to withdraw from the world to spend more time with God. But in order to be able to do that, they had to remain in contact with the world to some extent. They had to see their servants to be able to eat and drink and do everything. And because of the nature of the people who were understood to be anchorites, people who wanted to spend more time with God, then people were coming to see them for prayer and for counsel. And you've got Marjorie Kemp visiting Julian, and Marjorie mentions this, and it's recorded in 1413 that Marjorie goes. She spends some time telling Julian all about her own spiritual life and experiences. As a good anchorite, it seems that Julian did more listening to Marjorie than she did speaking in return, although given the amount of talking Marjorie Kemp does throughout the account of her life, it's not hard to imagine that somebody would not be able to get a word in edgeways, quite frankly. But there were engagements with the local community in other ways. All Hallows London Wall is one of a very few number of parishes, not just in London but across the country, where there is both evidence of an anchorite and also surviving church wardens' accounts. And this is very helpful and very useful in the work that I've done. We know there were at least 5 anchorites enclosed at All Hallows from the early 15th century up to the 1530s, because we know the names of 5 of them. There are records of more than that in the accounts, although we can't quite work out how many in total were there. And from the accounts, we can see how the anchorites interacted. They gave money to individuals who were in need. Some of that will then have been almost, if you like, it was a circular distribution system. People will have given money to the anchorite in thanks for their prayers, their counsel. That money was then given by the anchorite to others who were in need. They were also therefore then able to contribute to the maintenance of the church. And Simon Appleby is listed in the accounts as giving the largest individual donation when a new aisle was built at All Hallows. I mean, quite frankly, being an anchorite enclosed in a church where there's building work going on must have tested his prayers. Better person than I am. And what is also interesting is there's evidence in the accounts and elsewhere that because it was such a safe place, nobody was going to break in. You didn't dare try to break into an anchor hold because God would strike you down if you did, which meant that it was perfect as a safe deposit location. So you've got evidence of people leaving valuables with the anchorite. Now, Ancrona Wissa in the 13th century and other rules specifically say this is not a good idea. An anchorite should not be having this kind of interaction with their community. And yet we've got evidence in the 14th, 15th, 16th centuries that this happens. So theory, practice, it don't always work. And sometimes what is surprising and genuinely is surprising, and I didn't know this until I was looking through the stuff on All Hallows. Anchorites were sometimes let out. William Lucas, who was one of Simon Appleby's predecessors at All Hallows, and he was enclosed probably in the early 1470s. In 1477-78, he was given approval by the Pope to go on pilgrimage to Rome because he'd always wanted to. So he thought, why not? I'll ask the Pope. And the Pope said, yeah, okay, as long as you're back within 15 months. Now we know that William Lucas definitely came back to his cell because the accounts in 1486 list a payment for ringing the bell at his funeral. So he went to Rome, he saw Rome, he came back, and presumably he spent, throughout the next 6-8 years of his life in his cell with good memories of his time in Rome. So solitary life wasn't always solitary, and the permanent enclosure wasn't always permanent. Except most of the time it was, but a few times when it wasn't. And it wasn't just pilgrimage. There aren't that many records of people coming out of their cell. There are some, yes, and there may be more that we don't have anymore, that we just don't have any further records of. And sometimes you get instances where you'd really, really like to know a bit more about it, but we just don't. And I've pulled out these 4 examples of people who left their cell for various different reasons. Christina Carpenter, who was enclosed in Shear in Surrey, she was enclosed in the summer of 1329. As far as we can tell, that was her request. That was, her saying, this is my vocation, I want to be an anchorite. Some point in the next 3 years, though, she left. But we don't know why, and we don't know exactly when. In the summer of 1332, though, she's asking the bishop, can I come back in? Can I be re-enclosed? Now, scholars may, this isn't just me, scholars may be putting 2 and 2 together and making 5 here. But it's possible, just possible, that her re-enclosure wasn't entirely of her own volition. Because when she went back in the second time round, the anchor hold was made more secure. We don't know. Of the other instances I put here, Isolde de Heaton is one of those examples where relationships break down between the anchorites and the community where they're enclosed. Isolde was enclosed at Whalley Abbey in Lancashire, and that cell, that anchor hold, had been set up in 1360 by the first Duke of Lancaster, who was, his grandson later became Henry IV. However, having been enclosed after the death of her husband, leaving her young children, they were both under 10 at the time, in the care of relatives. After a few years, it became clear that the relatives actually weren't looking after the children as well as could be expected. I think that they were trying to push at least one of them into a financially advantageous but possibly unwanted marriage. So Isolde then found herself needing to look after the rights of her children. She asked the Archbishop of Canterbury if she could be released from enclosure, which was granted. And at that point, the monks of Whalley Abbey specifically the abbot, asked the king if he could make sure that they wouldn't have any more anchorites. They'd done this, thank you very much. We don't want any more. William Alnwick, and I really rather like this one. He'd been an anchorite at Westminster. We don't know quite for how long, but in 1417, Henry V asked him to go and be the Confessor General to the Bridgetine community at Zion Abbey, which was just a bit further upriver from Westminster. Zion Abbey was the only Bridgetine community in this country. They followed the rule of Bridget of Sweden, and it was a mixed community. It was men and women, although they didn't interact within the community. So you had the nuns and you had the monks, but you had various figures serving both sides. And Henry V asked William Alnwick to go and be the Confessor General to the Zion Abbey community, having, to leave his cell at Westminster. Less than a year later, William is back in his cell because he missed the peace and quiet. He obviously couldn't cope with the rough and tumble of monastic life. So for some people, and going back to the reasons on one of the slides at the beginning, for some people, life in the cell genuinely was better for them than life in the outside world. There's also one instance where it turns out somebody who had been identified as an anchorite actually wasn't. Now, I've mentioned Margery Kempe a few times, and for those of you who don't know, she was born around 1373. She was married for about 15 or 20 years before she took a vow of chastity within marriage, and she travelled a lot around continental Europe and the Holy Land. And she was the first woman to have her life story written down in English, which includes a lot of deeply effective spiritual engagement with both Jesus and Mary. But we've only known about that since 1934. The manuscript of her book was lost, it was misfiled in a private library. And it was discovered completely by chance in 1934. Which caused a whole lot of upset in a lot of medieval circles, because before that, the name and the fact that she'd written anything at all were known only in 2 small extracts from her book, and I mean they are tiny. Compared with the book itself, these extracts are a very, very small percentage of the whole. And these were printed twice. They were printed by Wynkyn de Worde in 1501, and then reprinted by Henry Pepwell in 1521. Henry Pepwell added one word to what Wynkyn de Worde had printed 20 years earlier. And he describes Margery Kempe as an anchoress. We have no idea why. I mean, bear in mind, she'd been dead for not quite a century by this point. Where de Worde got hold of the book, we have no idea. Pepwell obviously just reprinted what de Worde had printed before him. Why Pepwell wanted to add in the fact that Margery Kempe was an anchoress, we really don't know. But it might suggest that even into the early 1520s, with everything that was starting to bubble up in terms of religious reform, there was a sense that anchorites had a particular status. So maybe Pepwell thought that he could sell more copies of the book if he presented it as being written by an anchorite. Who knows? As I said, by the 1520s, things were changing. And in 1537, Simon Appleby writes his will, June 1537. The legal process of dissolving the monasteries, the dissolutions, had started in 1535, a year after the Act of Supremacy in 1534 made Henry VIII the head of the church in England. And Simon Appleby will have been aware of this. But on the basis of his will, he seems to have expected that the tradition of anchorites at All Hallows would continue after him. Now, in the third paragraph that I've put on the slide, he states that the books and vestments which are within the bounds of the anchor hold should stay there to be used by his successor. So he's presuming that there will be a successor, presuming, however, that this is within a year and a day of his death. And after that, if nobody else is appointed, his executor can do what he likes. He also, at the start of the will, after commending his soul to God, he states that he should be buried in the grave which he has already dug in the floor of his cell. And it's likely that that grave was the one that he dug before his profession in 1513. So he's been in that cell for 24 years with an open grave. Now, the full will is longer, so I've sort of compressed bits. And I've left in the bit in the middle because I really, really like this, that he gives money for buns, cheese, and ale to be provided for his funeral. I like the sound of Simon. I really do. So Simon is probably the last anchorite in London. There's possible evidence of somebody else still occupying a cell somewhere in the city of London in about 1540, but that's a bit uncertain. As I said earlier, there is definitely evidence of somebody in Norwich in 1548, but that's about it. We get to the Reformation, and with the changes with monastic vocation, as understood, then sort of being completely swept aside, the particular form of anchoritic vocation also just seems to, it's a different time, people aren't doing this anymore. But it was there in different places, in many places across this country for, 300 years, 400 years. Now, Charlotte asked if I could offer some thoughts for further reading, if anybody's interested. And I've sort of split this into a few headings. If anybody does want to do any academic reading, then the book by Eddie Jones, Hermits and Anchorites in England, that's something of an update of Rotha Mary Clay's work. And what Jones does is it's almost it's not quite a textbook, it's a handbook. So he's got lots of primary and early secondary sources. So there'll be the rights of enclosure, there's sort of instructions as to how to live, there's evidence from wills as to financial support. So if you want to know more, that's a really good place to start. If you want to read a bit more about how medieval anchorites interacted with, engaged with, related to the communities they were in, then the edited book by Kate Gunn and Liz Herbert McAvoy is very good. I particularly recommend chapter 7, and you can probably guess why. And in that I talk a lot more about the accounts of All Hallows, London Wall, and the interactions with different anchorites at All Hallows and the community over 130 years or so. Health and safety legislation rather prohibits the actual physical walling up of people who want to live as solitaries these days. Can't imagine why. But there are still some people who will, for shorter or longer times, live as a solitary life. And Verena Schiller's book is well worth reading. She's an Anglican nun. She's a member of the Community of the Holy Name, who are now based in Hesel in North Yorkshire, or somewhere in Yorkshire near Hull. But Sister Verena spent about 25 years living more as a hermit than an anchorite, because she wasn't physically enclosed, on the Llŷn Peninsula in North Wales. And her book does give an insight into sort of what it might mean to live a solitary life with God. And then in fiction, Victoria Mackenzie's book came out last year, and it was something of a hit. So people may have heard about it, may even have read it. It's imagining the lives of Julian and Marjorie Kemp, based on both of their writings and framed around the encounter between the two of them. And then Robin Cadwallader's book, The Anchorites, that's very much more fictional, but it is about a young woman choosing the anchoritic life, not necessarily always for purely faith-based reasons, and then how she lives out that life in and around a medieval community. I think it's set in the 14th century, but I can't quite remember. So yeah, so that, I hope, is a ground floor guide to anchorites.